What happens when immigration enforcement collides with protest, grief, and public outrage, and a federal judge steps in to say enough? Because right now in Minneapolis, ICE isn't just being challenged in the street, it's being challenged in the court. And what's unfolding there is not just a local story, it's a warning sign for how immigration enforcement may operate across the country moving forward. Now, if you think this doesn't affect you because you are a citizen or because you don't live in Minnesota or because you're not involved, stay with me, because what happens when federal power meets public resistance has consequences for everyone. We're going to break down why a federal judge has restricted ICE's ability to detain and use force, how local and state leaders are now under federal scrutiny, and how everyday Americans, immigrants, citizens, organizers, families are reacting in real time. Today being January 17th, a federal judge in Minnesota issued a preliminary injunction limiting how federal immigration agents, including ICE, can operate during protests in Minneapolis. Now, this ruling comes days after the unrest following of January 7th fatal shooting of Renee Good, and also there was another shooting that happened in Los Angeles. He was a 43-year-old man shot on New Year's Eve by ICE agents. He was a father, he was a black man. So with all of that going on, an incident that has ignited mass demonstrations and drew heavy federal presence, according to the court order, ICE and federal agents may not detain peaceful protesters. 2, they may not use chemical agents like tear gas or pepper spray unless there is a reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Now, that's a critical language because up until this point, protesters and civil rights attorneys argue that immigration enforcement will use not just to enforce the laws, but to intimidate, suppress, and scatter dissent. And the judge had enough, and the judge reasoned, and the judge was logical and said, this is enough of a concern for me to intervene. And now this is very rare, right? Federal courts do not lightly strict DHS or ICE operations, especially during periods labeled as public safety or crowd control, which tells us something important. The court saw this as a constitutional issue, not just as an immigration issue, right? This injunction does not mean ICE has lost its authority, but it does mean that it just means now that ICE has judicial guardrails, okay? The court essentially said federal power does not override First Right amendments, the right to peaceful assembly, protection from unreasonable detention. So for immigrants, this matters very, very deeply. Now, for citizens, it should matter just as much because we know there are certain people, there are Native Americans being held by ICE agents, okay? So they are coming for everyone, okay? Because when enforcement agencies operate without clear boundaries, those boundaries don't magically reappear when the crowd changes. Today, it's immigration protesters. Tomorrow, it could be labor organizers. Next week, it could be faith-based groups. Next year, something entirely. So the ruling draws a legal line and is being watched nationally. Now, this is where another escalation happens. Following the protest and ICE operations, federal authorities opened probe involving Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey. This is not a routine thing, guys. Local leaders are now being scrutinized for how they coordinated or refused to coordinate with federal authorities, whether this is public statements and actions that obstructed enforcement, how state and city resources were being used during the protest. Now, this places Minneapolis at the center of a federal versus local power struggle. And it's risen a question many Americans are asking online. If local leaders try to protect their communities, will they be punished for it? From the looks of it so far, that's a possibility with what's happening in Minnesota. Now, that question is echoing all across social media, not just from activists, but from ordinary residents who don't want their cities turned into enforcement zones. And on social media platforms like TikTok, X, and Instagram, the reactions are divided but intense. You're seeing posts that say ICE has crossed the line, peaceful protest is not a crime, while immigration agents, handling crowd control at all, which is a valid question, right? And then there are some that are arguing federal law must be enforced. Local leaders shouldn't interfere. Public safety comes first. So what's striking is this: immigration is no longer being discussed as a only a border policy, but it's now being discussed as civil rights issue, a local governance issue, a constitutional issue, and that shift it matters to us, right? Because once immigration enforcement enters conversations about rights and protests, it stops being abstract and becomes personal. Now, the impact on everyday Americans. If you're an immigrant, you know you're hesitant to attend protests, vigils, or public gatherings, going to work. It's like you have to carry your green card or any of your legal documents to make sure that in case you get caught by ICE, that you're able to be fully prepared and present your documents, right? You may fear that being seen equals being targeted. And if you're a citizen, you may be asking why immigration agents are involved in crowd control. You may wonder what happens when enforcement expands beyond its original mandate. And if you're a parent, you're thinking about safety, about civic engagements becoming dangerous. And if you live in cities, this is, as you're watching these unfold, certain states like Nebraska is being targeted right now, okay? You are asking whether Minneapolis is a preview or a warning. And it surely is, in my opinion, a preview of what's to come in many other states. What happens in the Midwest doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to reach the East Coast, okay? So this injunction is temporary but influential. Other cities are watching closely. Civil rights groups are preparing similar legal challenges. Federal agencies are recollaborating strategy, and the political tension between the federal authority, state autonomy, local accountability is only intensifying. This is far from over. Now, as I said, this is going to go beyond Minnesota, okay? Immigration enforcement, civil liberties, public trust in the government, and how it's resolved will shape how ICE operates during unrest, how courts respond to enforcement overreach, how communities organize going forward. This isn't about sides, it's about systems. So what we're witnessing is not just resistance, it's recollaboration. So whether you agree with ICE, oppose ICE, or sit somewhere in between, you should care when courts step in and define limits on federal power, because history shows us this. When boundaries go unchecked, they don't stop expanding on their own. There's a reason why the American government has this checks and balances. Now, for more details, be sure to go ahead and subscribe and wait for our next episode. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I leave you all in the care of God.